Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the best in BC politics. Thank you so much for being here, for subscribing, watching on the YouTubes, you're watching on Check TV, you're on the Check Plus app, you're on your podcast providers. Thank you for being here. We are going to jump into the show this week. First, we're going to go around and introduce the panel, starting with Maclean Kay, editor of the Orca, here each and every week. Hello, Maclean.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Katy Merrifield, Vice President of Wellington Advocacy. Hello again, Katy.
Hey, Rob. Happy to be here.
And Jillian Oliver is away this week, but we have a great guest filling in for her. Sarah Miller, who was the director of the policy branch of the BC Green Caucus and is now a political strategist. Hello, Sarah. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
We are going to jump into old growth first, and we're going to go to you, Sarah, but just to sketch out for people the old growth issue, because on this show we have been talking quite a bit about the Fairy Creek protest, which is now, I guess, almost a year old. There's, I think, 1,100 arrests, the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history around the idea of whether the Horgan government's doing enough to protect old growth. We've been waiting for a plan. In advance of a plan, we were supposed to get deferrals, and that was a year ago, and here we are now finally getting this deferral plan of around 2.6 million hectares of land that will be saved from logging temporarily. There's a whole bunch of different ways into this, and we're going to go around and talk a bit about them, but why don't you start us off, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think for me, the main thing that stands out with this plan is I think it has the potential to be extremely significant in terms of how we manage old growth in BC. But at the moment, I think that's really what it is. It's mostly just potential. The biggest thing that I think actually changed this week is there's been a major change in how government talks about old growth. So finally, government is recognizing that there's different types of old growth forests. They're not all the same. They're using words like irreversible biodiversity loss. They're talking about ancient and rare forests. And I think that's really important because I think as soon as you start acknowledging that science and talking in that language, it becomes extremely hard to justify the status quo and to justify not changing how we manage these forests. I think the key thing that is missing that will determine how significant this actually is and how much of that 2.6 million hectares that the scientists identified actually gets protected or deferred and then protected is the financial support piece. So right now, First Nations have been given 30 days to respond, a very short timeline, and government has not committed to any financial support for nations and for communities that are affected, that are dependent on old growth logging revenues. So that is the key to see how serious government actually is about this.
Yeah, it's a lot to put on the nations. 18 months for government to develop this thing. We've all been waiting for it. Then they dump it on First Nations and say 204 nations in the next 30 days have to decide whether or not these deferrals are okay on their lands. And that's, I thought the Union of BC Indian Chiefs put it well when they said this is a political souffle that's sort of destined to collapse because it's just, that timeline is quite something when you sort of play it out, Maclean. What do you think of that?
I mean, it's just not going to happen. It's hard to put a finer point on it than that. The plan took 18 months to put together on the provincial end, which is long but not, hugely unusual. 30 days for 200 plus First Nations. I mean, it's impossible. You'd have better luck asking them all to walk to Victoria in time. It's an unreasonable amount of time for what Sarah quite rightly points out is a sea change in philosophy and policy, and asking them to not only examine the report, consult locally, and come back with a formal response in less than a month it's just not feasible. It's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a couple things to keep in mind, even if it does happen, and there's no guarantee it will, some nations do like to log, and they like to log sustainably, and that will, by not allowing the deferrals in some territories, that'll reduce the 2.6 million hectares down to some other smaller number. The deferrals aren't permanent. They're only going to last for probably around 2 years till there's another old growth plan by the government just on the eve of the next election. And reaction, Katy, was all over the place. You had environmental groups saying, it's okay, but it's not really enough. You had the forestry sector saying 18,000 job losses, 20 mill closures, $400 million revenue hit to the government. And then it didn't seem like anyone was really happy, but I don't know if anything jumped out at you on what you heard and saw on this.
Yeah, I looked at this from a communications perspective. When you're in government, I would say the best type of reaction to any kind of controversial announcement is essentially begrudging respect with some reservations from all parties involved. If you have both sides of an issue saying, look, we didn't get everything that we wanted, but progress was made, that I would consider a win. And for me, unless I'm reading the coverage wrong, I didn't see that at all. All I saw was every possible stakeholder pitched off at like a level 12 out of 10 for this one. As you mentioned, Kofi's rightly concerned about significant job loss and the closure of 14 to 20 mills. First Nations have very loudly condemned the lack of appropriate funding and the proper consultations, especially in a post-UNDRIP environment. And environmental groups are saying too little, too late. So I immediately thought of the climate plan from last week or 2 weeks ago. I thought the way that was executed was brilliant. They had validators from industry to former politicians to NGOs, like all endorsing their strategy. So I think this is kind of a perfect example of how critically important stakeholder relations, proactive issues management, and strong comms are. The climate plan, I think, had it, and this one did not.
And it does not appear to have ended the protest at Fairy Creek, although I don't really know if government's intention was to do that or if they think that they can do that or that's completely outside of their control. But the protesters haven't indicated they're leaving, and you've got that interim injunction in place. And so that political pressure we talked about in the past of in Premier John Horgan's riding, 1,100 people getting arrested on his government stance on old growth, that doesn't seem like it's going anywhere either. So I think there's still going to be a lot of pressure on the government to do more, to do something, to execute this plan in some way rather than just kind of letting it sit there for the next couple of years until they come up with a third plan. But I don't know. We'll see. I'm sure we'll be talking about it again as this kind of 30 days rolls through and whether or not how many nations actually sign on to this. Moving to another topic, which almost no one was really pleased about, except that everyone agrees with the sentiment of, we end up on the issue of decriminalization. And finally, British Columbia became the first province in Canada to submit a request to Health Canada asking for an exemption that would allow for small personal possession of illicit substances to not result in an arrest or a fine or a criminal record. I think the amount is 4.5 grams cumulative total of heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamines. The debate was instantly about whether that's not enough. Some user groups say it's not enough, it doesn't represent accurate use, so it's not going to be useful. Police say it's too much. Whole bunch of caveats on whether this isn't going to do what we hope it will do, which is reduce stigma and fear of a criminal record and help people access treatment or at least safe supply. Katie, what do you think of this? We've talked about parts of this plan. This seems to be another part. How does it all fit together?
Look, for me, before anyone gets breathlessly excited about yet another harm reduction initiative, I don't think this is going to save any lives. We have de facto decriminalization in the downtown east side already. I am not necessarily opposed to this, though. This is how I feel. The Portugal model is successful because it pairs decriminalization with a commission on drug dissuasion and mandatory treatment. So where is that? Like, why are we stopping halfway? I just find, like, here in BC, I feel like we are so beholden to drug liberalization advocates, as if making drug use easier is somehow like a safe and appropriate treatment for addiction. Like, for me, like, pair this with mandatory treatment options, and I would be the first one to endorse it. But until then, just hard pass for me.
Well, the political issue of mandatory treatment, like we've seen it play out with the Horgan government's attempt to do youth mandatory treatment, bill a year ago, and everyone jumped on. A lot of groups jumped on and said no. So that political environment is tough to, and I didn't hear government at all approach mandatory treatment in this. But I understand what you're saying. But I think that the best case that some people were looking for was, does this prevent someone from getting a criminal record for possession of something that in a certain part of the province you're never even going to get arrested for, ruining your life with that criminal possession record? Does it prevent someone from going and getting safe supply or safe consumption from the tainted drug supply? Does it at least do that? And I'm not entirely clear that it does or doesn't, but it's a step. Maclean, what do you think?
I mean, I think you make a good point in that it's a step, and that Katie's also right in that comparisons to Portugal fall short if you don't follow through with the other aspects of what they're doing there. It's always interesting to compare how we treat the opioid crisis in contrast with the pandemic, which has, I mean, if you absent the COVID-19 pandemic, the idea of being asked to, mask in a public place, or you're not allowed to dance at the bar, they make no sense. It's insane, and it's amazing that it's still taking us this long, years into the opioid overdose epidemic, to try something. Les Ling wrote a great piece in the Times Colonist this morning saying, "Well, look, the status quo is not working, so let's try this." I mean, I myself struggle with the idea of making it legal to carry meth, but we have to try something. And if, to Katy's point, if it's not far enough, okay, we can look after the fact, but status quo is killing people.
Yeah, no, and for sure, I think I agree with Katy as well, that we've talked a lot in previous episodes. The treatment system is a mess. There's gaps, there's wide chasms, and that needs to be done as well. And we have not made a lot of progress on that. Sarah, what jumps out at you on this issue and kind of the different ways that people are reacting to it?
Yeah, I do think this is a positive step. I think even though there's disagreement on, is this the right threshold or not, we've seen police come out and say they think it's too high, advocates saying it's too low, and there are other associated issues around the treatment program and that kind of thing. I do think it's positive. I think that the real power in this is that government is backing up its rhetoric around that drug use is a health issue and not a criminal justice issue with actual action. They've been saying that for a long time. And I think the power in this is the signal that it sends to people who do use drugs that they're not doing something morally wrong in government's eyes, that there's nothing to be ashamed of. I think the hope is that it reduces that stigma, helps to, and I think critically that it reduces the fear of being out in public, of accessing services, reduces that drive to use alone, which should hopefully indirectly at least save lives. But I mean, I agree. I don't think it's going to have an immediate impact on the levels of overdose deaths that we're seeing. Unfortunately, that's about the toxicity of supply, and this doesn't directly deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I guess the next question is, what does Ottawa do with this? And their, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau does not support widespread decriminalization. And he said that, but he does support helping BC in the overdose crisis. And you get the impression that they were going to improve the city of Vancouver's DECRIM application from a year ago. That still hasn't happened. Are they going to improve BC's? Does anyone want to jump in? Do you think this is a different dynamic in Ottawa for approving this than it is in BC? Anyone want to jump in on that?
Ottawa has been very reluctant to wade into the issue of decriminalization because the people who are opposed to it are very opposed to it. And they have a point. I raised the issue earlier of, do we really want to go to a place where it's okay to walk around with meth? And whether it's a good policy or not in terms of saving lives, it's a very understandable reaction. And the Liberals, not to put too fine a political point on it, rely on those votes. They need people in the suburbs who are deeply suspicious of drug use. They need people in ethnic communities that tend to have a more conservative outlook on issues like addiction. And so, yeah, it's a thorny political issue. And whether things have changed, well, Parliament hasn't really changed. Yes, we just had an election, but it looks exactly the way it did a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the hope is that Ottawa doesn't take too long on whatever it decides. I can't imagine they're going to reject this, but they should do it one way or the other, because I think BC has indicated if Ottawa doesn't get on board, they're just going to find some way to do it on their own. And that would set up a fascinating fight of some type if BC just tried to plow this through by issuing some type of, provincial mandate to police, which kind of already exists not to do this. Who knows? Who knows? We will watch that one. We're going to try a different topic here to close out the show, and that is there's lots of other things out there this week, so we thought we'd open it up, kind of a grab bag to the panel to kind of jump on individual stories that jump out at their mind that we haven't actually touched on yet, and maybe we wouldn't otherwise get to. So, Maclean, we're going to start with you on that. What else is going on that you want to hit on here as we go around the table?
Anytime an entire week of question period from the official opposition anyway is devoted to almost entirely one topic, that's obviously an issue that's floating out there. And here it's about autism supports for families with someone who has autism. And without getting into the policy shift that's being suggested by the government, what the BC Liberals have done is smart. And that's, instead of saying, well, we think this general point about this and this general point about that, they've introduced people by name, saying, Rob Shaw says this and has these concerns. And what's worse is when you bring up questions on behalf of people, when the government does what the government tends to do, which is sneer and dismiss and, heckle questions in question period, any government, because it's happened to other governments before, those land a little differently. And this built up all week until just yesterday we had a minister of the Crown, Nicholas Simons, forced to apologize for what even he described as an arrogant and intemperate note. It was a very ugly and disappointing end to a kind of a fascinating week where the BC Liberals, I thought, managed to kind of bloody the nose of the government a little on the issue.
Yeah, it's a good point. That the best question periods are when you bring in real people. And the irony in what Nick Simons ended up doing is that one of the best questions periods I've ever seen is when he and the New Democrats brought in people from the disability community and sat them in the public gallery and said to the BC Liberal government, why are you taking away this person's bus pass? Look at them in the eye up here in the gallery and tell this disabled person why you're clawing back their bus pass. And Nick Simons was involved in that. And then so to have this weird reversal now where the Liberals are raising personal stories of people having their autism supports potentially reduced or clawed back, as the Liberals call it, and the NDP viewing that as politics. God, it's just to watch it play out. It's just a reminder that nothing ever changes at the legislature. Just the party names and just the tactics, but people are always the ammunition and the tools, and they're used in certain ways, and sometimes it works for them and sometimes it doesn't. But the politicians are not your friends. They will switch positions on issues depending on if they're government or in opposition. It's just boggles the mind. But moving on. Anything jump out at you, Sarah? Was there any topics floating around out there you want to highlight this week?
Yeah, my pitch for the other thing that's happening this week is COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland. There's a lot happening over there this week. Obviously, Minister Heyman is over there and a lot of people from the environmental scene in BC. I think the key thing about this is Canada has made multiple pledges this week, and there are some really significant impacts at home. And I think the most significant one of those is yesterday, on Thursday of this week, Canada made a pledge to stop financing fossil fuels abroad. So that means billions of dollars that were going out of Canada to support oil and gas internationally is now going to be shifted to clean energy. I think the obvious question that people are already starting to ask is, what about domestic policy? And in BC, that's extremely relevant. We put a lot of money into oil and gas subsidies every year, and BC is reviewing some of that program now. So I think this just adds pressure on BC to end those subsidies, and adds that issue of, why are we doing one thing internationally and a different thing domestically? Mm-hmm. So I think there's some really relevant implications here.
Do you think they're going to end the subsidies? I mean, there was a big report on it that kind of called them archaic and out of date, and the government in its climate plan said they'll announce their decision on subsidies, I think, in the February budget. What's your best guess, Sarah? Do you think those are going to go away, or do you think there's pressure on government to keep some of them?
So I don't think they can't all go away, because government has signed contracts that have locked them into some of these subsidies for years, right? The LNG Canada agreement locks government in. So unfortunately, government's already made some decisions that lock us into a certain pathway. I do think they will make changes. I think they need to. And I think that the Glasgow conference has added pressure. So I'd expect some significant changes where they can, but I don't think they'll go away entirely. Yeah,
maybe in the deep well oil credit kind of side, where the report was talking about how it encourages unsustainable natural gas fracking that otherwise wouldn't even happen if the province didn't subsidize it. So yeah, we'll watch for that. That's a good one. Katie, what's on your mind this week? Anything jump out?
Yeah, we got some results from the heat dome investigation. And I think it's important, not just obviously the issue itself, but kind of what it reveals about the government's popularity as well as the current BC landscape. So, we know almost 600 people died, the majority from June 25th to July 1st. As a reminder, there was a really prominent announcement on June 29th. That was the announcement to lift all of, or almost all of, the COVID restrictions for the summer. And I think, while this was certainly good news at the time, there is an argument to be made that, there were competing priorities in government. Perhaps government didn't pay enough attention to the impending weather disaster. We've talked about this before, but I don't want to litigate the issue. What I find fascinating is I think it highlights the popularity of this government and the public's ability to either just not care or to forgive this administration really easily. I can't imagine the BC Liberals getting away with this. I can't. And for comparison's sake, I recall there is a man who died in a treatment center from an overdose in 2016. Premier Clark was accused of having literal blood on her hands as a result of that. So whereas we saw almost 600 people, mostly seniors, caught in their own home, like baking to death. And I just don't feel like there's been a lot of public backlash.
Yeah.
And I find that amazing.
Well,
And also a little bit alarming.
Is it because, and we talked about this with the FOI issue, is it because that individual issues rarely produce a kind of emotional backlash? Some of them do, but they are often built on an anger or a frustration or a distrust or a whatever on a government that's built up from a bunch of other smaller issues. So to go back to the disability bus pass issue we talked about, that was built up about 10 years of refusing to raise the minimum wage, cutting back on disability and income assistance. You build a pyramid of a perspective of dismissiveness, and then you top it off with a cherry of an issue. And I'm not sure the heat dome has that build to the outrage, and maybe that's why. I don't know. It's an awful lot of deaths, unnecessary deaths, on an issue that the province could have handled better, could have warned about, could have dealt with better. The 911 wait times form part of this, and clearly the government has a role to fix that, and it hasn't been fixed. But I understand the point. I just kind of wonder if maybe it's because there isn't a sniff test on this government yet on the issues that would lead to more of a blowback or an outrage on that. I don't know if anyone wants to dispute my hypothesis.
Or the sniff test is just, I don't know, more difficult for center-right administrations.
Maybe. Yeah.
McLean,
maybe.
what do you think?
I think you're both right. I think there is a steeper uphill climb for governments of a certain persuasion, and I mean, look at last year and the COVID numbers compared to and the public perception of how government was doing, as opposed to now when BC is literally the worst jurisdiction in the country. And it just is. And this is sad and devastating. And yet, no one is looking at the provincial government in that respect. And maybe they shouldn't. But I mean, just next door in Alberta, when, cases were terrible, it was explicitly the fault of the provincial government and the people in the premier's office. And now that title, that dubious distinction has moved into Victoria, it's like, well, personal responsibility.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Thank you, Sarah, for filling in this week. Thanks to everyone on the panel. Thank you for listening and watching, and we will see you next week here on Political Capital.